She was 21 years old and homeless, sleeping on a park bench with her only inheritance, a tarnished silver pocket watch that had belonged to her late father, its heartbeat silenced since the very moment he took his last breath. She had no home to return to, no money in her name, just a threadbare backpack and $10 she had kept smoothed flat and hidden inside the lining of her shoes. She was 21 years old and homeless, sleeping on a park bench with her only inheritance, a tarnished silver pocket watch that had belonged to her late father, its heartbeat silenced since the very moment he took his last breath. She had no home to return to, no money in her name, just a threadbare backpack and $10 she had kept smoothed flat and hidden inside the lining of her shoes. And with those $10, she did something the entire town called madness. She bought the deed to an abandoned stone clock tower on the northern edge of the ridge, a crumbling gray monolith that had been sealed by the county and scheduled for the wrecking ball by spring. The auctioneer had looked at her with a mixture of pity and quiet derision, his voice thick with the smell of stale tobacco and years of low expectations. "It's a hollow shell, girl," he had muttered. "No power, no water, and that clock hasn't ticked since before you were born." Clara didn't answer. She only tightened her grip on the paperwork, her hands stained with the faint, persistent grease of machines she no longer owned. But what nobody in that town knew, what even the yellowed architectural blueprints in the basement of City Hall didn't show, was that inside the main gear of that tower, the mechanical heart that had been frozen for 80 years, lay a secret that defied any material valuation. It was a fragment of history caught in the teeth of time, waiting for someone lonely enough to finally listen to the language of gears. And tell us in the comments below, where are you watching from today? We love seeing how far these quiet roads travel. Clara stood before the auction block, the cold October rain of Pennsylvania turning the world into a palette of bruised purples and slate grays. The air smelled of damp asphalt and the sharp, metallic tang of the copper coin she squeezed in her pocket. She felt the weight of the town's gaze, the businessmen in their warm coats, the retirees looking for a bargain, all of them seeing only a girl who had lost her way. But Clara saw something else. She looked at the photograph of the tower pinned to the auction board and saw a reflection of her own soul. Sturdy stone hiding a broken interior, a mechanism designed for purpose that had been rendered useless by neglect. Sometimes, the cheapest things in life cost us the most courage to claim. A home is not just four walls and a roof. It is a promise that the world hasn't forgotten you yet. She handed over her last $10, the paper crinkling like a dried leaf, and felt a strange electric shiver run through her fingers as she took the heavy iron key. Fate doesn't always knock on your door. Sometimes it simply waits for you to be brave enough to buy the lock. The walk to the ridge was 3 miles of uphill struggle against a wind that tasted of pine needles and impending snow. As the town lights faded behind her, the tower began to emerge from the mist like a titan waking from a long sleep. It was 60 feet of rough-hewn sandstone, draped in vines that looked like skeletal fingers clinging to the rock. The silence here was heavy, a thick, velvet quiet that seemed to swallow the sound of her footsteps on the gravel. This tower was built in a time when men believed that things should last forever, a philosophy that had clearly fallen out of fashion in the world Clara had just escaped. As she reached the base, she looked up, her neck aching from the angle. The great clock faces, one pointing toward the valley and the other toward the mountains, were cracked and clouded with bird droppings and soot. They were blind eyes, staring out at a world that had stopped caring what time it was. She realized then that time isn't just a measurement, it's a relationship between the past and the future. And when that relationship breaks, we are all just wandering in the dark. Clara took the key from her pocket. It was a massive piece of black iron, cold as a winter stream. As she slid it into the keyhole of the heavy oak door, she felt the resistance of 80 years of rust and grit. She leaned her shoulder into the wood, her breath hitching in her chest. The door didn't just open, it groaned, a long, low vibration that she felt in her teeth. It was the sound of a lung finally taking in air after a lifetime underwater. As she stepped inside, the darkness was absolute, smelling of ancient stone, dry rot, and the faint, ghostly scent of whale oil, the lubricant used by the clock keepers of a century ago. She clicked on her small LED flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom like a scalpel. Dust motes danced in the light, thick as snow, disturbed for the first time since the end of the Great War. The ground floor was empty, save for a few rotted crates and a pile of coal dust near a small stove. But as she moved the light upward, she saw the staircase, a dizzying spiral of wood and iron that vanished into the shadows above. The tower was watching her now. It held its breath, waiting to see if this girl with the grease-stained hands was the one it had been dreaming of for 8 decades. Clara hadn't always been a wanderer of park benches and bus stations. She was born into a world of rhythmic ticking and the comforting, heavy scent of motor oil and peppermint, the personal trademark of her father, Arthur Vance. He was a man with eyes the color of wood ash, a quiet soul who believed that the universe was not a collection of accidents, but a vast, intricate machine. "If you understand the system, Clara," he would say, his voice barely audible over the hum of a lathe in their workshop, Vance and daughter, "you can fix the study of it. Every problem has a mechanical root. A clock stops not because it wants to, but because a single tooth is chipped or a drop of oil has turned to gum. People are the same. We break in small ways before we collapse in big ones." She spent her childhood on a high stool, her small fingers learning the weight of a brass caliper before they learned the grip of a doll. Her father taught her that every material has a memory. Steel is stubborn and requires heat to bend. Brass is patient but brittle if pushed too hard. He taught her the logic of systems, that you never force a gear into place. If it doesn't fit, it's because you haven't understood the alignment. By the time she was 16, Clara could strip down a maritime chronometer and reassemble it in the dark, her hands guided by the vibration of the springs alone. But the most important lesson wasn't about metal. It was about the eternal motion, the idea that energy never truly disappears. It only changes form, waiting to be channeled by someone with the right tools. The system of her life, however, suffered a catastrophic failure when she turned 19. A freak accident at the shop, a heavy industrial compressor failing, took her father in an instant. A week later, the creditors arrived. Their suits are as sharp and cold as the needles of a gauge. They didn't see the history in the walls or the philosophy in the blueprints. They only saw assets and liabilities. They took the shop, the family home, and the legacy. Clara walked out into the world with nothing but a backpack and her father's silver pocket watch, the last thing he had been working on. It was a beautiful, haunted object, but its hands were frozen, the second hand twitching slightly every few seconds, like a dying pulse that couldn't quite find the strength to beat. For 2 years, Clara lived in the cracks of the world. She learned the bitter geometry of the streets, which alleys held the heat, and which doorways were safe from the wind. She felt the weight of invisibility, the way people look through you when you have no address. But even in the depths of her poverty, her hands remained restless. She would find discarded lighters or broken umbrellas and fix them, leaving them on benches for others to find. It was her way of proving she still existed, a silent rebellion against a world that had labeled her broken. Maybe it was the way the cold Pennsylvania wind bit through her chore coat that morning. Or maybe it was the way the silver watch in her pocket felt heavier than usual. But when she saw the legal notice for the clock tower auction, she felt a pull that was older than her own grief. As she began to climb the spiral staircase of the tower, the wood groaned under her weight, a rhythmic complaint that echoed the thumping of her heart. Every 10 steps, she had to stop to catch her breath, the air growing colder and thinner as she ascended. The walls of the tower were lined with massive iron weights on chains, suspended in the darkness like the pendulums of a giant's heart. She reached out and touched one of the weights. It was cold, so cold it felt like it would burn her skin, but beneath the chill, she felt a faint, deep-seated throb. The tower wasn't dead. It was in stasis. It was a system that had been paused, its energy stored in these massive iron blocks, waiting for a catalyst. Maybe it was the way the light fell through the arrow-slit windows, painting bars of gold on the dust. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to retreat, as if giving her space to work. Maybe it was the way she finally felt found by a place that was just as lost as she was. She reached the third landing, where the internal workings of the clock faces were housed. Here, the scale of the machinery was staggering. The size of carriage wheels were interlocked in a complex web of bronze and iron. She saw the escapement, the delicate mechanism that regulates the release of energy, looking like a rusted bird's nest high above. This was the brain of the tower. She moved her flashlight over the surfaces and saw the marks of previous keepers, scratches in the metal, dates etched into the stone. The last. The date was 1944. Beneath it, a name was carved with frantic precision: Isaac. Clara knelt on the floor, ignoring the grit that ground into her knees. She pulled a small bottle of kerosene and a rag from her bag. She didn't start by looking for a secret. She started by looking for the soul of the machine. She began to wipe the grime from the smallest gear on the secondary drive. As the black sludge came away, a brilliant, warm glow of high-quality bronze emerged. It was the first sign of life. She realized then that restoration isn't just about making things look new. It's about removing the layers of neglect until the original intention is revealed. A system doesn't lose its purpose just because it's covered in dust. It only loses its voice. And Clara was determined to make this tower speak again. To understand why this tower fell into such a deep, iron-heavy slumber, one has to travel back through the fog of history to the winter of 1944. At that time, this small mountain town was a vital hub for the war effort, a place where the pulse of the nation's industry was measured by the very clock Clara was now trying to save. The keeper of the tower then was a man named Isaac Stein. Isaac was a master horologist who had fled the encroaching darkness of Berlin just as the shutters were closing on the world. He was a man of silence and precision, a refugee who brought nothing with him but his tools and a secret that weighed heavier than the iron weights of the tower. Isaac carried the Heart of Stein, a collection of raw, uncut diamonds that his family had spent generations accumulating as jewelers to the royal courts of Europe. In the paranoid atmosphere of 1944, Isaac knew he was being watched. He saw shadows in the valley that didn't belong to the trees. He realized that if the authorities or local looters ever broke down his door, the last legacy of his bloodline would be scattered to the winds. And so, in the dead of a moonless November night, Isaac did what only a mechanical genius could conceive. He didn't bury his treasure in the earth where rot could reach it, nor did he hide it in the walls where a sledgehammer could find it. Instead, he hid it inside the one system he trusted with his life. He spent 12 hours of frantic, silent labor dismantling the main gear, the great wheel that governed the entire mechanical heartbeat of the tower. With a jeweler's lathe, he hollowed out the central hub of the axle, creating a void within the very soul of the machine. He placed the diamonds inside, wrapped in oilcloth, alongside his greatest unfinished work, a set of blueprints for a second life mechanism, a clock that would never need winding, powered by the subtle changes in atmospheric pressure. He sealed the gear hub with a custom-fitted plate, camouflaged it with grease and dust, and then he stopped the clock. He broke the alignment just enough so that no one, not even a skilled engineer, could make it tick without dismantling the entire core. Isaac disappeared the next morning. Some said he fled to Canada. Others said he was taken. The tower was sealed, its secret resting in a tomb of bronze for 80 years, waiting for someone with the hands of a mechanic and the heart of a ghost to find it. For the next 2 months, Clara Vance disappeared from the world and into the stone. The townspeople below would look up and see a faint, flickering light in the high windows, but they assumed it was just the ghost of the ridge or a squatter waiting to be evicted. But inside, a miracle of labor was taking place. Clara had no money for power tools or chemical baths. She had only her father's grit and the logic of the grind. She began with the labor of silence. Every morning at dawn, she would wake up in her sleeping bag, the air smelling of kerosene and the mineral scent of cold sandstone. She would spend 8 hours on her knees, using a steel brush and a mixture of vinegar and salt to scrub the rust from the lower drive shafts. The sound was a constant, rhythmic rasping, a metallic song that filled the empty chambers of the tower. By the second week, her hands were a map of small cuts and oil-stained calluses, but when she wiped away the slurry of grime, she saw the sight of the light catching on the polished copper, turning the room into a hall of amber fire. Maybe it was the way the gears seemed to warm under her touch, as if absorbing her own body heat. Maybe it was the way the dust motes began to settle, no longer agitated by her presence, but welcoming her. Maybe it was the way she realized that is not just iron oxide. It is the physical manifestation of time's tears, waiting to be wiped away. Clara used a technical trick her father had taught her. She ground up old bronze shavings and mixed them with marine-grade epoxy to fill the deep pits in the bearing races. Logic of systems. She learned to feel the friction. She would spin a gear and press her ear against the stone wall. If she heard a skip, she knew the alignment was out by a fraction of a millimeter. She was talking to Isaac through the metal. She was apologizing to the machine for the decades of loneliness. But despite all her cleaning, despite the gallons of high-grade lubricant she had scraped together the money to buy, the main gear remained stubborn. It sat at the center of the room like a silent god, refusing to grant her the one thing she wanted, a single tick. The crisis came on a night when the Pennsylvania winter finally broke its restraint. A massive ice storm hammered the ridge, the wind howling through the arrow-slit windows with a sound like 1,000 screaming violins. The tower shuddered, the old stone masonry groaning under the pressure of the gale. Clara was huddled near the main gear, holding a single candle, her breath forming white plumes in the freezing air. She was exhausted, her spirit flagging. She looked at the great wheel and whispered, "Why? I've given you everything. Why won't you turn?" In the flickering, dancing light of the candle, she noticed it, an anomaly she had missed in the flat glare of her flashlight. The central hub of the main gear was not perfectly symmetrical. There was a thin, circular seam hidden behind a layer of ancient candle wax and solidified grease. It was a plate, barely 4 inches across, held in place by 4 tiny, countersunk screws that were never part of the original industrial design. These were watchmakers' screws, delicate, precise, and entirely out of place in a tower clock. Clara's heart began to hammer against her ribs, a wild, erratic rhythm that surpassed the storm outside. She reached into her father's toolkit and pulled out his smallest precision driver, a tool used for the internal escapements of maritime chronometers. Her fingers were shaking so violently she had to grip her right wrist with her left hand to steady the blade. The driver bit into the slot. The wax crumbled. The world narrowed down to a single point of cold steel. The first screw groaned, a high-pitched metallic shriek that was lost in the roar of the wind. Then the second, then the third. As the fourth screw came free, the circular plate didn't just fall. It was pushed outward by the pressure of an internal spring. Clara caught the plate in her palm, her flashlight rolling across the floor, painting wild arcs of light against the ceiling. She reached into the dark, hollow void of the axle hub. Her fingers brushed against something soft, not metal, not stone, but fabric. The fabric was black velvet, so old and brittle it felt like it might dissolve into smoke against her skin. With trembling fingers, Clara pulled the small pouch from the hollow of the axle. As the cloth brushed against the rim of the gear, it tore, and a cascade of blue-white fire spilled out onto the dusty sandstone floor. Clara didn't scream. She didn't gasp. The world simply went silent, the roar of the Pennsylvania storm outside fading into a dull, distant hum. There, scattered amidst the grime and the oil stains, were 24 raw, uncut diamonds, each one the size of a hazelnut, glowing with a cold, inner light that seemed to defy the darkness of the room. They were the heart of Stein. But Clara's eyes didn't stay on the stones for long. Inside the hollow, tucked deeper into the iron core, was a copper cylinder sealed with brittle red sealing wax. Beside it lay a heavy vellum envelope addressed in a sharp, slanted hand, "To the one who listens." Clara sat back on her heels, the cold of the floor seeping into her bones, but her chest felt as though it were filled with molten gold. This was the moment she had been moving toward her entire life, from the first crayon sketch of a gear to the last night on a park bench. She broke the seal of the envelope. The paper was thick and smelled of cedar and the sharp, acidic tang of 1940s ink. Maybe it was the way the ink seemed to shimmer under her flashlight, as if the words were still wet. Maybe it was the way the silence of the tower finally felt like a conversation instead of a void. Maybe it was the way she realized that wealth isn't the presence of gold, but the absence of fear. The letter began, "My name is Isaac Stein. If you are reading this, then the world has remained standing, and you have done what no one else had the patience to do. You have looked past the rest. You have understood that a system is only as strong as its smallest alignment." Isaac's words painted a picture of a man who had lost everything but his integrity. He wrote of the nights he spent watching the valley, waiting for a knock on the door that would mean the end of his life. He explained that the diamonds were never meant for him. They were a security deposit for the future. "I was a man of the old world, a world that believed in the permanence of stone and the truth of a ticking clock. That world is gone now, but time remains. The stones you found are to pay for the restoration of this Sentinel. They are to pay for your hands, which I know must be stained with grease as you read this. Do not spend them on vanity. Spend them on the system." But the true treasure was in the copper cylinder. Inside, Clara found the Second Life blueprints, a mechanical masterpiece that utilized the expansion and contraction of air within the tower's stone walls to wind the mainspring. It was a clock that breathed with the earth itself. Isaac had designed it, but never had the chance to build it. He was leaving the completion of his life's work to a girl he would never meet. A girl who had bought his tower for $10. Take care of her, the letter concluded. The tower is yours now, not because you bought it, but because you heard it. When the clock ticks again, remember that even in the deepest night, the gears are moving toward the dawn. Clara stayed in the tower until the sun broke over the ridge. The storm had passed, leaving a world of brilliant, blinding white. She didn't go to a jewelry store. She didn't buy a car or a mansion. Instead, she went to a numismatist and a stone specialist in Philadelphia. She sold only 3 of the stones, enough to fund the first 6 months of Isaac's vision. The restoration was a technical odyssey. Clara became a familiar sight in the town below, no longer a homeless girl, but a woman of purpose. She hired a team of traditional masons to repoint the sandstone. She worked alongside a master glazier to replace the clock faces with reinforced, hand-blown glass that captured the light of the valley. But the how-to of the Second Life mechanism was her greatest challenge. She spent weeks studying Isaac's notes, learning how to seal the air chambers and calibrate the bellows. She had to learn the physics of barometric pressure, mixing her father's mechanical logic with Isaac's visionary engineering, logic of systems. She used her father's old silver pocket watch, the one that had stopped when he died, as the master regulator for the entire tower. She realized that by fixing the tower, she was finally finishing the repair her father had started on that last day in the workshop. 6 months to the day after the auction, the town gathered at the base of the ridge. The old Sentinel stood transformed. The gray monolith was now a beacon of warm, golden stone. The clock faces shone like moons against the Pennsylvania sky. Clara stood in the wheelhouse, her hand on the release lever of the escapement. She looked at her father's watch, now synchronized to the millisecond. She thought of Isaac Stein, who had hidden his heart in a gear to save it from a dying world. She thought of her father, who had taught her that every broken thing is just a puzzle waiting for a solution. The lever clicked, the metal sang, the heartbeat returned. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The sound was immense. It was a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the stone and down into the very earth of the town. It wasn't just the sound of time passing, it was the sound of a system being restored to its rightful alignment. Clara didn't stop at the clock. She used the remaining stones to establish the Vance Stein Institute of Horology on the ground floor, a school where foster children and those the world had labeled broken could learn the trade of the hands and the philosophy of the heart. She became the keeper not just of the time, but of the town's spirit. That is the thing about the directions our lives are pulled in. We often think we are being discarded when we are actually being relocated to where we are needed most. We think a loss is an end, when it is often just the clearing of the ground for a recreation. For some people, the place that has been waiting is a family farm they never knew they loved. For others, it is a rusted houseboat in Louisiana, a stone cottage in Ireland, or a landing office on a muddy river bluff. The form doesn't matter. What matters is whether you can stand inside the ruins of your own life, look around at the dust and the rust, and feel something settle in your chest. Something that says, "This is the room that has been waiting. This is where I begin." Clara Vance was 21 years old and homeless. She had $10 in her shoe, and she spent it on an abandoned clock tower on a lonely ridge. It was the best $10 she ever spent. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that it is never too late to start over. And tell us in the comments, what is the one thing in your life that you've been told is junk, but you know, deep down, just needs the right pair of hands to fix. See you on the next quiet road.